The gate swung open at midnight, and Orville Turner nearly wept. He had been lying in the dirt for 3 hours, his side torn open by a bullet that had grazed his ribs and carved a trench through his flesh like a plow through hard earth. The blood had soaked through his shirt, through his vest, and pooled beneath him in the dust of the Nevada trail. He had dragged himself off the road when he heard the riders coming, 4 of them, maybe 5, their horses churning up the dry ground with the kind of purposeful fury that told him they were not done with him yet. He had pressed himself behind a clump of sagebrush and held his breath and watched them thunder past, and when the sound of hoofbeats faded, he had crawled toward the nearest light he could see through the darkness. It was a farmhouse, set back from the main road, ringed by a proper wooden fence that spoke of a person who took their boundaries seriously. He had reached the gate and found it latched from the inside with a heavy iron mechanism he could not work from where he lay. He had pressed his forehead against the lowest fence rail and thought about his life, the dark past that had chased him across 3 territories, the secrets he carried like stones in his pockets, the forced choice he had made 6 months ago that had set everything in motion. He had pounded weakly on the fence post twice and then gone silent, because the effort had cost him more blood and the world was starting to tilt. He had thought about calling out. He had decided against it. Every instinct he possessed, honed over 12 years of surviving the kind of places decent people did not go, told him that a stranger bleeding on your fence in the middle of the night was not a welcome arrival. He had resigned himself to the cold earth. He had thought with a bitter clarity that surprised him that no one was going to help him, not here, not ever. Then he heard footsteps on the porch, then the creak of the front door, then the click of a lantern being unhooded and a circle of amber light swept across the yard and found him through the fence slats. A long silence followed. "Are you alive?" a woman's voice said, calm, measured, not frightened. He managed to lift his head. "Barely," he said. Another pause. He heard the sound of something being set down, the lantern, he realized, and then the unmistakable metallic double click of a rifle being cocked. "I am going to open this gate," the woman said, "and if you are lying about being alone, you will find out very quickly that I am not someone you want to have made an enemy of tonight." The gate swung open. And Orville Turner, who had spent 12 years believing that the world owed him nothing and intended to prove it at every opportunity, looked up at the silhouette of a woman standing over him with a Winchester model 1873 leveled at his chest, and felt something inside his chest crack apart that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. 3 weeks earlier, Orville Turner had ridden into the town of Caldera Creek, Nevada, on a horse that was in slightly better condition than he was, which was not saying much. It was September of 1882, and the high desert was doing what it always did in early autumn, baking in the days and freezing in the nights, with a wind that came off the mountains smelling of sage and distance. Caldera Creek was a silver town, the kind that had sprung up like a fever blister on the landscape 6 years ago, when a prospector named Hendricks had pulled a fist-sized chunk of near-pure galena out of a dry creek bed, and immediately run his mouth about it to every man within earshot. The town had swelled. The mine had been claimed by a company called Marston Silver and Mineral, and Hendricks had drunk himself to death within 18 months, which was a kind of cautionary tale the town had absorbed and then ignored entirely. Orville had come to Caldera Creek because he had a name written on a folded piece of paper in his shirt pocket, and that name was Gerald Peck. And Gerald Peck was the man Orville believed had betrayed him. It was not a simple betrayal. Simple betrayal's a man stealing another man's horse, or lying about a card hand, or sleeping with someone's wife. Those were the ordinary commerce of the frontier, and Orville had seen enough of them to feel only a mild contempt for the people involved. What Gerald Peck had done was of a different order entirely. 12 months ago, Orville had been working as a deputy marshal under a man named Harrison Cook in Tucson, Arizona Territory. He had believed in the work. He had believed, somewhat naively for a man of his experience, that the law was a thing worth serving, and that serving it meant something. Gerald Peck had been a fellow deputy, and Gerald Peck had been feeding information to the Ray's brothers, a pair of smugglers who moved stolen silver and opium between the border and the rail lines, for the better part of 2 years. When Marshal Cook had finally gotten close to the truth, Gerald Peck had arranged for the evidence to point to Orville instead. Orville had fled Tucson 1 step ahead of a warrant and 3 steps ahead of 2 men the Ray's brothers had sent to ensure he never reached a courtroom. He had been running ever since. The dark past he carried was not one of genuine guilt, but that was almost worse, because guilt at least carried with it a kind of ownership, a thing that was yours. What Orville carried was a false stain, a lie that other men believed about him, and the knowledge that the people who could clear his name either could not or would not do so. He had 2 options as he saw it: find Gerald Peck and force a confession, or disappear permanently into the frontier's vast indifference and live as a drifter forever. He had chosen the harder road. Caldera Creek's Main Street was a river of mud from a recent rain, and the boardwalks on either side were crowded with the usual population of a Silver Town miners in from their shifts, merchants watching the traffic with the calculating eyes of people who understood that the real ore was in a working man's wages, a couple of gamblers with the particular pallor of men who did not go outdoors by choice. Orville rode to the livery stable at the end of the street, arranged for his horse, a sturdy blue roan mare he called Juniper, to be fed and watered, and then stood in the street and considered his next move. He needed information about Gerald Peck. He needed it quietly because if Peck was in this town, he would have friends, and if Peck's friends learned someone was asking about him, Orville would find himself in the kind of situation he had been in 3 weeks hence, bleeding in the dark outside a fence, hoping someone would help. He went to the saloon, not because he intended to drink heavily, but because in every western town from El Paso to Sacramento, the saloon was where information went to circulate. It was the town's nervous system. He ordered a whiskey. He did not much drink and listened. The Caldera Creek Saloon was called the Copper Crown, and it was a proper establishment, a long mahogany bar, a piano that someone was actually playing with skill, 3 card tables, and a pair of oil paintings on the walls that had presumably been transported at considerable expense and effort, because someone had decided that art was the correct way to signal that this was a town of permanence and not merely a camp waiting to fail. Orville settled himself at the bar and let the room wash over him. He heard, within the first 20 minutes, references to several things that would prove relevant to his immediate future. A recent silver shipment that had been robbed on the mountain road, a land dispute between a rancher named Cassidy and the Marston Company, and most interestingly, a woman named Bancroft who had apparently, 3 days prior, diagnosed a problem with the Marston Mine's ventilation system that the company's own engineer had missed, a problem that would have collapsed the secondary shaft within a week and potentially killed 14 men. "She just looked at the timbers and told them," said the man 2 stools down from Orville, speaking to his companion with the slightly aggrieved tone of someone who found competence in unexpected places to be personally inconvenient. Measured the load-bearing angles with her own instruments and told them the whole center support structure was torqued by 2 degrees. 2 degrees. Company engineer had been there for 3 days. She did it in an afternoon. "Bancroft widow," said the other man. "Ida Bancroft, yes, you know her. Everybody knows her. She keeps to herself, but everybody knows her." Orville filed this away without much conscious intention. He was interested in Gerald Peck, not in a woman who understood mine engineering. He ordered another whiskey he did not drink and went back to listening. He found what he was looking for about an hour later, from a loose-tongued miner named Whitfield who had been buying himself courage from a bottle of rye, and was now at the stage of inebriation where a sympathetic ear felt like a confessor. Gerald Peck, it emerged, was indeed in Caldera Creek. He had arrived 4 months ago under the name George Preston, which was not even a very creative alias, and he had gotten himself hired as a bookkeeper for Marston Silver and Mineral, which position gave him access to shipment schedules and cargo manifests, information that was, Orville noted with a cold anger that settled in his stomach like lead, exactly what someone feeding intelligence to silver thieves would want. The recent robbery on the mountain road began to make a great deal more sense. Orville thanked the miner for his company and stood up from the bar very carefully, because he had spent enough time in the kind of situations that could go sideways at any moment to know that the way you moved your body communicated information to everyone in a room. He moved slowly, unhurriedly, like a man with nothing particular on his mind. He left the saloon and stood in the cooling night air and breathed. Gerald Peck was here. Gerald Peck had a job and a new name and was, apparently, continuing his very particular trade of betrayal under circumstances that suited him. And Orville had found him. He did not go directly to confront the man. He was not impulsive, had not survived 12 years on the rougher edges of the frontier by being impulsive. He went instead to the rooming house, secured a room for a week, and slept, and in the morning began the careful work of observation. He spent 4 days watching Gerald Peck from a distance. Peck was a slight man, sandy-haired, with the kind of forgettable face that nature sometimes provides as a gift to people who make a living being unremembered. He went to the Marston offices every morning at 8 o'clock, left at 6, ate dinner at the hotel restaurant, and retired to his rooms. He was unremarkable in every visible way, which Orville knew to be the point. On the 5th day, something disrupted Orville's careful surveillance. He was posted in the shadow of the dry goods store across the street from the Marston building, watching Peck's morning arrival, when he became aware that someone was watching him. She was standing at the entrance to the surveyor's office 3 doors down, and she was watching him with the direct, unapologetic gaze of someone who had both noticed something and decided to note it openly rather than pretend otherwise. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back under a practical hat, and she wore a divided skirt and a canvas work jacket that were clearly chosen for function. She was holding a leather case of the kind that instrument makers used, and she held it with the absent familiarity of someone for whom it was an extension of her hand. When she realized he had caught her watching him, she did not look away. She held his gaze for a moment, not a challenge exactly, but something measuring, and then turned and went into the surveyor's office. He thought about the conversation he had overheard in the saloon. Ida Bancroft, the widow who had spotted the mine problem in an afternoon. He put her out of his mind. He had work to do. On the 7th day, Gerald Peck spotted him. Orville had been careful in the way that 12 years of carefully watching his back had made him, but Peck apparently had his own watchfulness, honed by the same frontier that had shaped Orville, and on the 7th morning he stepped out of the Marston building, looked directly across the street, and went completely still. Their eyes met across 40 feet of dusty Nevada Street, and Orville saw the recognition in Peck's face. The flicker, then the calculation, then the decision. Peck turned and walked back inside the building with a steady pace that was almost admirable in its control. By that evening, Orville's rooming house room had been tossed. Someone had gone through it with professional efficiency, looking for what? Documents, evidence. Orville had kept nothing incriminating in the room, having learned long ago to carry what mattered on his person. But the message was clear. Peck had people here, as Orville had suspected, and those people now knew Orville's face and knew where he slept. He checked out of the rooming house that night and took Juniper from the livery stable and rode north out of Caldera Creek into the dark. He had done this before, folded himself back into the landscape, disappeared, regrouped. He needed time to think, to plan, to find another angle of approach. He needed to be somewhere that Gerald Peck's eyes could not find him. What he had not counted on was the riders. They came out of the darkness fast and purposeful, 3 men he did not know but whose intent was unmistakable. Someone had told them where to go and what direction to travel, and the someone had been Gerald Peck. And the fact that Peck had arranged this ambush within hours of spotting Orville told him that Peck had been prepared for this possibility, that he had already, at some point, made arrangements for the disposal of inconvenient visitors. Orville had ridden hard and Juniper had run beautifully, and he had gained enough distance that when the shot came, it was from too far away to be truly accurate. But too far away was not far enough. The bullet had caught him along his right side, tearing through flesh and grazing rib, and the pain had been a white-hot revelation that knocked the air from his lungs and very nearly took him off the saddle. He had kept riding. He had gotten far enough ahead that the riders gave up the chase. Or perhaps they thought they had done enough, because losing a man in the Nevada dark on an unfamiliar road was entirely possible, and they may have thought he would simply die out there. He had lost track of time and direction in the darkness, operating on pure instinct and the gelding steady common sense of his mare. He had seen the light of the farmhouse and made for it. He had reached the gate. He had concluded that no one would help him, and then the gate had opened. "Can you stand?" Ida Bancroft asked him. He was lying in the dust inside her property line now. The gate closed and relatched behind him, and she was crouching 4 feet away with the Winchester resting across her knees, and she was looking at him with an expression that was simultaneously calculating and not unkind. "I can try," he said. "Tell me where you are hit before you try," she said. "If the bullet is still in you and you stand wrong, you will make it worse." "Grazed," he said. "Ribs, right side. I don't believe it is still in." She moved the lantern closer and looked at the wound with clinical attention that surprised him. She did not wince, did not hesitate, did not perform any of the social theater that most people, particularly most women he had known, tended to perform around injury. She simply looked at it and assessed it. "You are right about the bullet," she said. "But you have lost considerable blood, and the wound will need cleaning and binding properly, or it will go infected. Can you reach the porch if I help you?" "I can reach the porch," he said, and made himself believe it. She helped him up with the practical competence of someone who had done physical work all her life and understood leverage and weight distribution. She was not a slight woman. She was perhaps 5'6", solidly built, with strong hands, and she got her shoulder under his arm and walked him across the yard without complaint or ceremony. He was 3 inches taller than her and probably 70 pounds heavier and had been shot, and she managed him with what he could only call efficiency. He was, even in the fog of pain and blood loss, impressed. She sat him in a wooden chair on the porch and went inside and came back with a lamp, a basin of water, clean cloth, a bottle of carbolic acid, a needle already threaded, and a bottle of whiskey that she set beside his chair. "The whiskey is for you," she said. "The carbolic acid is also for you in a different sense. This is going to be unpleasant." "I have been through worse," he said. "I did not ask," she said, and began to work on the wound. She was fast and precise, cleaning the wound with the carbolic without flinching when he hissed through his teeth. And when she determined that the wound had a section that needed closing, she stitched it with the same economy of motion she seemed to apply to everything. It was not comfortable. Carbolic acid and a needle in torn flesh are not comfortable, but she was quick enough that he did not suffer any longer than necessary, and when she was done and had bound the whole thing tightly in clean cloth, she sat back and looked at him. "Now," she said, "tell me who you are and why 3 riders were shooting at you on my road at 11 o'clock at night." He looked at her in the lamplight. She looked back at him. The Winchester was leaning against the porch rail within easy reach of her right hand, and he was very clear-eyed about what that meant. "My name is Orville Turner," he said, "and the answer to your second question is going to take a while." "I have the whole night," Ida Bancroft said. "It does not appear that you are going anywhere." Her name was Ida Bancroft, and she had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband, Robert Bancroft, had been a mining engineer, a genuine one, trained and credentialed, who had come west from Pennsylvania with a mind full of geological theory and a practical genius for reading rock formations. He had taught her everything he knew, partly because he believed in her intelligence and partly because he had understood early in their marriage that Ida's mind was not something you could offer a half portion to and expect her to be satisfied. She had grown up in Colorado, the daughter of a surveyor, and she had learned to read land the way other girls learned to read primers. She could look at a hillside and know what was underneath it with a certainty that was not mystical but methodical, built from years of training her eye to see the subtle language that rock and soil and slope spoke to anyone willing to pay attention. When she had married Robert Bancroft at 24, she had already been doing informal surveying work for her father's clients for 3 years, work that she had done well and that her father had billed under his own name because the clients would not have paid a woman for it. Robert had died of a fever 2 years ago, caught in the aftermath of a mine flood that had soaked him to the bone, and then not let him warm up properly for 2 weeks. He had gone from strong and capable to gone in a fortnight, and the speed of it had been a betrayal she still sometimes woke at night thinking about. He had left her the farm, a modest account at the Territorial Bank, and a head full of engineering knowledge that was, in the Nevada frontier of 1882, an unusual and very useful thing for a woman to possess. She had stayed. Some people, mostly people who did not know her, had expected her to sell the farm and go back to Colorado or Pennsylvania or somewhere with a larger population of women living alone. She had not done that. She had taken on surveying contracts for the mining companies operating in the territory, had built a reputation for accuracy and reliability that was unusual enough to be remarkable, had fended off several attempts by those same companies to underpay her or discount her work, and had developed in the process a precise and comprehensive understanding of when someone was trying to use her and when they were dealing with her honestly. She was, at 31 years old, not lonely exactly. She was something more complex than lonely. She was a woman who had loved her husband genuinely and missed him in a deep, specific way, and who had found that the world after grief was not empty, but different, inhabited by a version of herself who had become harder in some places and softer in others in ways she did not always recognize until they surprised her. She had not opened that gate out of naivete. She had opened it because she had been awake at midnight working on a set of survey calculations for a contract she needed to finish by Friday, and she had heard the horses in the dark, 3 sets of hoofbeats moving fast and purposeful, and then a considerable silence, and then the very quiet sound of something pressing against her fence. She had taken up the Winchester. She slept with it close enough to touch, had for the past year and a half since a Marston Company representative had made it very clear that there were people who would prefer she not submit her report on a particular mineral rights dispute, and she had gone to look. She had seen a man lying in the dust on the other side of her fence, and she had seen that he was bleeding, and she had made a series of rapid calculations. He was one person. He had not called out for help, which meant he was either unconscious or exercising restraint, and unconscious people generally did not press themselves carefully against fence posts in controlled positions. The riders had not come back, which meant they either thought they had finished the job or were satisfied he would finish himself. The man was not trying to get in. He had not attempted the gate latch, had not tried to climb, had not called out. He was simply near her fence because her fence was what was there. All of this she had processed in approximately 15 seconds, standing on her dark porch with the Winchester cocked and her lantern unhooded, and she had decided to open the gate because leaving a bleeding man in the dirt on the other side of her fence was not something her conscience would permit, and because she was confident enough in her ability to handle a threat that the risk of that threat did not outweigh the human necessity of providing aid. She was not reckless. She was clear-eyed about risk and clear-eyed about necessity, and she had acted accordingly. Now she sat across from Orville Turner in the lamplight and listened to him tell her the story of Gerald Peck and the false evidence and the Ray's brothers and the 2 years of running, and she listened the way she listened to everything with the whole of her attention, sorting and weighing and noting what fit together and what did not. He was not lying to her. She was good at detecting lies. It was, in a different way, the same skill as reading rock formations. You looked for inconsistency, for the places where the surface story did not match the underlying structure. His story was consistent in the way that true things generally were complicated and unglamorous, and not arranged for easy sympathy. A man constructing a lie to gain a woman's trust would not include as many details that reflected badly on himself, would not admit as freely to the failures and the moments of poor judgment. Orville Turner told her about the night he had not reported a conversation he should have reported, about the week he had spent trying to find evidence on his own, rather than going to the marshal with what he suspected, about the ways in which his own pride and stubbornness had made Gerald Peck's plan easier to execute. "You trusted someone you should not have," she said when he had finished. "More than once," he said. "That is the truth of it. And now Peck knows you are in the territory and has arranged for you to disappear." "He tried," Orville said. "It did not fully take." She looked at him for a long moment. He had lost color from the blood loss, but his eyes were clear and direct, and they did not slide away from her gaze, which she had noted from the moment she had seen him clearly. People with hidden motives tended to have eyes that moved. "Can you walk by morning?" she said. "Well enough. Then we need to talk about what you intend to do next," she said. "Because if Peck's men come looking for a body and do not find one, they will know you survived. And if you survived, you are somewhere. And if you are somewhere, they will look." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You said we." "I did," she said. "This is not your problem, Mrs. Bancroft." "It intersects with my problem," she said, "which makes it at least adjacent." She stood up and went inside and came back with a folder of papers which she set on the table between them. "I have been contracted to survey a mineral rights dispute for the Caldera Creek Town Council. The disputed land runs along the North Mountain Road, the road where Peck's men shot you tonight. I have been collecting evidence for 3 weeks that suggests the Marston Company has been misrepresenting their claim boundaries, possibly with the assistance of a company bookkeeper who has access to the original survey filings." Orville stared at her. Then he said slowly, "A bookkeeper." "George Preston," she said. "Who I have reason to believe is not who he says he is, because the geological data he appears to have manipulated requires a level of technical knowledge that a standard bookkeeper would not possess." The silence that stretched between them in the lamplight was the kind that happens when two separate rivers of understanding meet and recognize each other. "Gerald Peck," Orville said, "before he was a deputy marshal, worked for 2 years as an assistant to a mining claims attorney in Santa Fe, which would give him exactly the knowledge needed to manipulate survey filings," Ida said. "He has been doing this here," Orville said. It was not quite a question. "Someone has been doing it," Ida said, "for at least a year. The Marston Company has been filing claims on land that does not match the original survey boundaries, which land happens to contain some of the richest ore deposits in the territory, land that was registered to independent miners and smaller operations. Those people have been bought out or driven out, and the money the Marston Company has been paying them is a fraction of what the land is actually worth." Orville thought about the robbery on the mountain road, the silver shipment that had been hit. He thought about what a man like Gerald Peck would be worth to a company like Marston Silver and Mineral, a man with knowledge of law and records, and the kind of careful dishonesty that could be made to look like clerical error. "He is not just hiding here," Orville said. "He has built himself a whole new operation." "That appears to be the case," Ida said. "Which is why the people who shot at you tonight did not simply ride you down and finish it. They needed to know what you knew and who you had told." This particular point, which Orville had not fully worked through in his blood-loss fog, landed with cold clarity. "They will be back," he said. "They will be back," she agreed, with the equanimity of someone who had already factored this into her calculations. "So we have tonight to decide what to do about it." She went inside and made coffee, which was the most practical thing she could have done. And they sat on her porch in the small hours of the morning, while the Nevada night ticked and breathed around them, and they planned. Her plan, it turned out, was substantially better than anything Orville had been working toward. His approach had been essentially confrontational: find Peck, force a confession, find a way to get that confession to someone with the authority to act on it. It was a plan that depended on Peck behaving in ways that people rarely behaved when cornered, and it required Orville to operate in a town where Peck's people knew his face. Her plan was built on evidence. A confession from a frightened man under duress is not worth much legally, she said. In the Arizona territory, yes, I understand there is a warrant with your name on it. That warrant is based on evidence. To counter it, you need better evidence, documented, witnessed, provable evidence. That makes it impossible for the territorial court to ignore. I am not a lawyer, Orville said. Neither am I, Ida said. But I have worked with enough legal processes around mineral rights to understand how evidence functions. What you need is the same thing I need: a complete documentation of what Peck has been doing here, who authorized it, and how it connects to his previous activities in Arizona. And you can do that through the survey dispute. I am already doing it, she said. I have surveying data, comparative filings, and a set of calculations that demonstrate, definitively and without ambiguity, that the claim boundaries Marston has been filing are false. What I need that you can provide is the connection between George Preston and Gerald Peck, real name, prior history, confirmation that the knowledge he is displaying here is consistent with a specific background that the false identity cannot account for. Orville looked at her across the papers spread between them in the lamplight. This woman, this widow who had opened her gate at midnight to a bleeding stranger, and then proceeded to know more about his problem than he did, was looking back at him with the calm, focused intelligence of someone who had already built a structure in her mind, and was explaining its blueprint. He felt, in that moment, a complicated rush of emotions that he was not accustomed to feeling, and therefore did not immediately know what to name. "You are a remarkable person," he said, before he had quite decided to say it. She looked at him with the slight surprise of someone who had not expected that particular statement. Then she said practically, "I'm a person who would like to resolve a problem that has been making my life difficult for 3 weeks. The fact that resolving your problem and resolving my problem happen to require the same actions is fortunate for both of us." "Still," he said. She looked at the papers for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "You should sleep," she said. "The spare room is inside. You are in no condition to be useful to either of us in your current state, and I need you functional." He opened his mouth. "That was not a question," she said, and stood up and went inside. He slept until mid-morning, which was not something he was accustomed to doing, and he woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of instruments being calibrated in the next room. He lay still for a moment in the spare room of Ida Bancroft's farmhouse and stared at the ceiling, and tried to understand what exactly he had walked into, because it did not feel like anything he had previously walked into, and he had walked into a considerable variety of situations over the past 12 years. He got up carefully. His side was a dull roar of pain that sharpened into something pointed when he moved incautiously, but it was manageable. He dressed and went to the kitchen, where there was coffee and a plate of bread and dried beef left on the table with the evident expectation that he would find it without being supervised. He ate and drank, and then followed the sound of the instruments to the front room, which Ida had apparently converted into a working office. There were 3 drafting tables arranged in an L configuration, and on each table were maps and survey documents and calculation sheets covered in a precise, dense handwriting that was clearly hers. A theodolite, a surveying instrument for measuring angles, which Orville recognized because he had once spent 6 months working with a survey crew in Colorado, sat on its case near the window. Several hundred feet of measuring chain were coiled neatly by the door. Ida was at the central table, using a compass and a parallel rule to work through a set of bearing calculations. She did not look up when he came in, but she said, Coffee is on the stove." "I found it," he said. "Thank you." He looked at the documents spread across the tables. "Can I ask what you are working on?" "The bearing verification for the North Claim boundary," she said. "I have the original survey from 1876 and the Marston amended filing from 1880. I am calculating whether the bearing discrepancy at the northwest corner is within the margin of error that a legitimate resurvey could produce, or whether it is outside that margin and therefore indicative of deliberate falsification. And," she looked up at him over the work, "it is 14 degrees outside the acceptable margin. At that distance, 14 degrees represents approximately 1,100 feet. The amended filing moves the claim boundary 1,100 feet to the southwest, which puts the Haverson vein entirely within Marston's claim territory." "The Haverson family," he said. "Sold out 18 months ago," she said. "For 40 cents on the dollar, according to the county recorder's documents, because they were told the boundary dispute made their title uncertain." He stood in the doorway of her working office and looked at the maps and the calculations, and at the woman who had built this case methodically and precisely over 3 weeks, and he felt the complicated rush from last night return, and this time he recognized it more clearly, and it startled him enough that he had to deliberately redirect his attention back to the practical problem. "What do you need from me today?" he said. "Tell me everything you know about Gerald Peck's background," she said. "Education, employment history, anything that documents his prior knowledge of survey law and claims filing procedures. I need to establish that the person operating as George Preston has knowledge that is inconsistent with a standard bookkeeper's training, and I need that inconsistency to be documented from an independent source." He spent the morning telling her everything he knew about Gerald Peck, and she wrote it down with the precision of a court recorder, asking clarifying questions that were sharp and exactly targeted. By noon she had a document that laid out Peck's established background in a way that connected clearly to the technical irregularities she had found in the Marston filings. "This is good," she said, reviewing what she had written, "but it is not yet enough. Your testimony about his background is not independently verified. You are a man with a warrant in his name, and Peck's lawyers will attack your credibility directly." "I know," he said. "That is why I need the confession." "No," she said firmly. "Not a confession. What you need is a corroborating document from the Arizona records that establishes Peck's background independently of your testimony. The New Mexico legal record of his work with the claims attorney in Santa Fe would do it. That record is in Santa Fe. I know where it is," she said. "I also know that we can wire the territorial courthouse and request a certified copy, which will arrive by the end of the week if we send the wire today." He looked at her. "You want to send a wire from the Caldera Creek telegraph office, the same telegraph office where everyone in town, including Peck's associates, can read the outgoing messages." She met his gaze. "I want to send a wire from the Reno office," she said, "which is 60 miles north, and where my colleague Harriet Folsom works for the district land surveyor and has both access to the telegraph and the professional discretion to handle this without advertising it." She paused. "I have a contract in Reno I was going to execute next month. I can move it up." "You planned this out this morning," he said. "I planned most of it last night while you were sleeping," she said. "I had the time." He stared at her for a long moment. He had been in the company of many capable people in his life, marshals and scouts, and frontier lawyers and operators of various kinds, and he had respected most of them to some degree. But looking at Ida Bancroft in the morning light, surrounded by her maps and calculations, with the precise architecture of a plan that was genuinely better than is laid out in her clear handwriting, he felt something he could not quite define, a species of admiration so complete that it had a physical quality, like standing in a strong wind. "You are not doing this just for the professional resolution," he said. "Not entirely." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Haverson family lost their home. They had 3 children. I knew them." She picked up her compass and went back to her calculations. "That is also a reason." They left for Reno 2 days later, traveling by the northern road rather than the main Caldera Creek Road, which added 8 miles to the journey, but kept them away from the territory that Peck's people were likely monitoring. Orville rode Juniper. Ida rode a strong-boned bay gelding named Copperfield that she handled with the same efficient competence she applied to everything. The first day of riding was quiet. He was still moving carefully around the wound, and she rode with the measuring attentiveness of a person used to traveling through landscape. She was also reading professionally. She noted things he did not, the way a hillside's color changed along a particular line that indicated a geological fault, the track of water through a dry ravine, the stress fractures in a rock face that suggested specific mineral composition beneath. "How did you learn all of this?" he asked, when she had explained the significance of a particular cliff face they were passing. "My father," she said, "and then my husband, and then many years of my own work." She paused. "And books." "There are not as many books on the subject as there should be, but the ones that exist are very good." "Your husband was also a surveyor, a mining engineer," she said. "There is significant overlap." She was quiet for a moment. He was a good teacher and a good man. He could hear the grief in it, clear and specific and not performed. He did not offer the kind of hollow comfort that people offered when they did not know what else to do. He simply acknowledged it. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. "That is not adequate for what it was, I know." She glanced at him sideways. "No," she said, "it is not, but it is honest, which is worth more than adequate." They stopped for the night in a sheltered draw near a spring that she knew, which told him she had traveled this way before. She made a fire with the practical speed of an experienced camper and cooked beans with salt pork and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they ate in comfortable silence that surprised him, because he was not, as a general matter, comfortable in silence with people he did not know. "Can I ask you something?" he said, when the meal was done and they were sitting with their coffee on opposite sides of the small fire. "You can ask," she said. "Why did you open the gate?" She looked at him across the fire. "I have been asked that question twice now in different forms," she said. "Once last night and once just now. You deflected the first time." "I did," she said. "The practical answer is that I heard riders, heard silence, heard something at my fence, and determined that the situation warranted investigation with an appropriate degree of caution. The Winchester was the appropriate degree of caution." "And the other answer," he said. She looked at the fire for a moment. "I have spent 2 years building a life around being unafraid of difficult situations," she said. "Robert died, and after Robert died, I realized that the thing I was most frightened of was not any specific danger, but rather the habit of closing doors against the unknown. A person alone on a frontier farm who closes every door is not safe. They are merely isolated. There is a difference." She picked up her coffee cup. "A man was bleeding outside my gate. Closing the door on that was not acceptable." "Most people would have considered it acceptable," he said. "I am not most people," she said, without any particular vanity. "Just as a statement of fact." He looked at her in the firelight and thought that she was exactly right about that, and that the recognition of it was doing something to him that he was going to need to eventually think about carefully. They reached Reno on the second afternoon and went directly to the Land Surveyor's District Office, where Harriet Folsom turned out to be a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who took one look at Ida's documents and one look at Orville and said, "All right, Ida, tell me everything." They told her. She listened with the same quality of focused attention as Ida, asked several questions that were as precisely targeted as Ida's questions, and then said, "The certified records request will go out today. You will have the Santa Fe courthouse response within 4 days if my counterpart there is as efficient as I believe him to be." She looked at Orville. "The warrant in your name in Arizona Territory, I have a professional acquaintance in the Tucson Marshal's office. Not Harrison Cook, who I gather is part of the problem, but his deputy, a man named Augustine Vargas. You know him?" "Vargas," Orville said, and a memory surfaced. "I know him. He was brought on after I left." He has been quietly investigating the evidence irregularities in your case for approximately 6 months, Harriet said. He has not said so publicly because he does not have enough yet to move against Peck's people in Arizona without getting buried himself. What you have, combined with what Ida has, is enough. Orville sat very still. You know Vargas. I handle survey records for the Federal Land Office, Harriet said. Deputy Marshal Vargas came to me 4 months ago with questions about certain land transactions. We have been in careful communication since. She looked at him steadily. You were not as alone as you believed. The silence that followed was one of the stranger silences of Orville Turner's life. He had spent 18 months believing that he was entirely alone in this, that the truth of what Gerald Peck had done was something he was going to have to excavate and present by force, against the resistance of everyone and everything. The knowledge that someone else had been quietly pulling at the same threads, that a deputy marshal he had never met had looked at the evidence and smelled the wrongness of it, that landed in him in a way that took him a moment to process. He looked at Ida. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something gentle, without being soft, the expression of someone who understood what a particular kind of loneliness felt like and recognized its ending. 4 days. He said to Harriet. 4 days, she confirmed. Stay in Reno. I know a boarding house that does not advertise its guests. They stayed in Reno for 4 days, which was not what Orville had anticipated, and turned out to be something he was grateful for in ways he had not expected. They worked during the days, Ida completing her Reno surveying contract with an efficiency that impressed the district office clients considerably, Orville helping her carry equipment and manage the logistics of field work in a way that left him quickly clear on the fact that he had been underthinking the complexity of what she did. On the second day, she set up the theodolite on a hillside above the city to verify a bearing for the contract survey, and he watched her work it, adjusting the instrument with fine, certain movements, reading the vernier scale, calling out numbers and recording them, checking and rechecking. And then she did a calculation in her head that he followed as far as he could and then lost, and announced the bearing within. She told him, 30 seconds of arc. He looked through the theodolite himself when she was done and tried to read the scale and could not, and said so. It takes practice, she said. The divisions are small. How much practice? Years, she said without apology. The same as anything that requires precision. He thought about the things he could do: shoot accurately under pressure, track a trail that most people would not see, read a situation and respond to it faster than most people could think, and how many years of specific attention those things had taken. He nodded. They ate dinner together each of those 4 evenings, in the rooming house's small dining room, and they talked in the way that people talk when they are learning each other. Not performing, not constructing appealing versions of themselves, but actually talking, which is rarer than it should be. He told her about his childhood in Kansas, about his father who had been a Methodist minister and his mother who had been a genuinely frightening woman in the best possible sense, stubborn and principled and entirely without vanity, who had raised 4 children on the edge of the frontier with the conviction that life was what you made it, and that making it well required both intelligence and work. He told her about the years of marshaling and the things he had believed about the law and what it was for, and about the way those beliefs had been complicated but not entirely destroyed by what had happened to him. You still believe in it, she said on the second evening. The law. I believe in what it is supposed to be, he said, which is not always what it is. That is a sophisticated position for a man who has been actively harmed by it. I have had time to think, he said. She smiled at that, a real smile, not the polite social expression that was technically also a smile but was its own different creature. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way that hit him somewhere behind the sternum. On the third evening, they were talking about Robert. She had offered it carefully because he had asked carefully, and she said something that he thought about for the rest of that night. The hardest thing, she said, was not the grief itself. Grief is real and terrible, but it is honest. It tells you the truth about what mattered. The hardest thing was the way people assumed the grief meant I could not continue, that I would need to be directed, managed, decided for, as if the death of a husband translated automatically into an incapacity in the wife. She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. Robert never thought that way, and his absence felt like the removal of the only person who saw me clearly. For a while, I thought that I had been depending on being seen clearly by him, and that perhaps I could not manage it alone. And then I realized that was also wrong, because what he had given me was not the seeing itself. It was the confirmation that what I already saw about myself was accurate. Orville did not say anything immediately. He turned that over carefully and looked at it and understood why it was true and why it mattered, and what it said about both the woman sitting across the table from him and the man she had lost and missed. "He sounds like he was worth missing," Orville said. "He was," she said. "And he would have found the current situation very interesting. He had strong opinions about land fraud." She paused. "He also would have liked you, I think. You have a particular quality of attention that he valued in people." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What quality is that?" She looked at him for a moment. "You actually listen," she said. "You do not simply wait for your turn to speak. It is uncommon." On the fourth day, the records from Santa Fe arrived. Harriet brought them to the boarding house herself, mid-morning, with the expression of someone carrying good news and knowing it. The certified records showed that one Gerald Peck, of no fixed address, had worked from 1875 to 1877 as a legal clerk for the firm of Abernathy and Crane, mining claims attorneys of Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory. The records included a detailed description of his duties, which had included preparing claim surveys for filing, reviewing original survey documents, and drafting amended claim applications. The technical knowledge required for what someone operating as George Preston had done in Caldera Creek was not merely plausible for Gerald Peck's documented background. It was a near-perfect match. "This is it," Ida said, looking at the documents. "This is the corroborating evidence." Harriet had also heard from Deputy Marshal Augustine Vargas, who had telegraphed through the Reno federal office in response to Harriet's careful message. Vargas was currently in possession of 2 affidavits from former Ray's Brothers operatives who had turned territorial witness in an unrelated case and had, in the process, described a deputy marshal in Tucson by physical description and manner who matched Gerald Peck precisely. He had been waiting for the documentary connection. "He wants to come to Caldera Creek," Harriet said, "with a warrant. Your warrant in Arizona is going to be suspended pending investigation. He has the authority to do that." Orville looked at Ida. She was reading through the Santa Fe records with her full attention, making notes in her precise handwriting, and she was, he realized, more genuinely glad about this development in its aspect of justice for the Haverson family than in its aspect of resolution for him. He found this not disappointing but the opposite of disappointing, because it told him something true about who she was. "When can Vargas be here?" he asked Harriet. 4 days by horse if he rides now. 3 if he has access to the rail line to Winnemucca and then horses from there. "Wire him," Orville said. "Tell him to take the train." They rode back to Caldera Creek the next morning, moving carefully, taking the high road rather than the valley route. Orville was riding well now. The wound had settled into a manageable stiffness that still caught him occasionally, but no longer cost him his breath, and Ida was in excellent spirits, which expressed itself not as effusiveness but as a kind of concentrated energy, like a spring wound tight. They stopped for lunch near a creek and sat on rocks in the thin autumn sunlight, and he looked at her eating dried apple from her saddle bag with the cheerful appetite of someone who had been doing satisfying work. And he recognized, with a clarity that was not quite comfortable yet, that he was deeply and seriously attracted to this woman in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary appreciation for an attractive person, and everything to do with the specific and irreducible fact of who she was. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Again," she said with a slight smile. "What do you intend to do after this is resolved?" She looked at him. "Continue working," she said. "I have 3 survey contracts pending after the Caldera Creek dispute is settled. The District Land Office in Carson City has been asking about a larger regional contract for the past month, which I have been considering. You will stay in Caldera Creek. I have a farm there," she said, "and an established professional reputation. Why would I leave?" He looked at the creek. The water ran clear over smooth stones, catching the light. "I do not know what I will do," he said, "after this is finished." He paused. "That is the first time I have thought about after in quite a long time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "What would you want?" "If the warrant is cleared and Peck is dealt with and you are free of it, what would you want?" He had not considered the question in a concrete way. It had felt for 18 months like a luxury he could not afford. He considered it now. "I was a deputy marshal," he said, "and I believed in the work, but I do not think I want to go back to that specifically. I have been moving for a long time and I am tired of moving." He paused. "I would like to stay somewhere." "Somewhere," she said. "Somewhere good," he said. They looked at each other across the creekside rocks in the autumn sunlight, and it was one of those moments that has a before and after to it, not quite anything said, but something acknowledged, something mutual that both of them recognized and neither rushed. "Finish eating," she said, eventually. "We need to make another 15 miles before dark." He smiled and picked up his dried apple and did. They reached Caldera Creek in the late afternoon of the following day, coming in on the North Road, and they went directly to Ida's farm rather than to the town. The farm was undisturbed. She checked it with systematic efficiency, walking the perimeter before going inside. And she settled her horse and Orville settled Juniper and they went in, and she made coffee and dinner, and they sat at her kitchen table, with the map spread out, and went over the plan for the next 3 days until Deputy Marshal Vargas arrived. The plan required Ida to submit her completed survey report to the Caldera Creek Town Council, which she had been contracted to do, and which she would now do, and to file simultaneously with the county recorder a formal dispute of the Marston claim boundaries, backed by her documented calculations. This would create a legal process that would make it extremely difficult for the Marston Company to continue normal operations without addressing the dispute, and it would put the falsified filings on the official record in a way that Peck and whoever had authorized the fraud could not simply make disappear. It also, she said matter-of-factly, would almost certainly provoke a response. "They will not want this on the public record," she said. "They have been very careful to keep the irregularities out of any documented official process. A formal survey dispute filed by a credentialed surveyor is a different category of problem than informal complaints." "You expect them to try to stop you," Orville said. "I expect them to make an attempt," she said. "Yes." "And you are going to file anyway?" "Yes," she said. "I am also going to make copies of everything and deposit those copies with Harriet Folsom in Reno and with the town council clerk and with the county sheriff." She paused. "The county sheriff is named Jim Beaumont and he is honest. I have verified this." "How did you verify it?" "I submitted an invoice dispute with his office 8 months ago and observed how he handled it," she said. "He was meticulous, impartial, and did not attempt to use his position to influence the outcome in favor of the larger economic interest. For a frontier county sheriff, that is a sufficient proof of integrity." Orville thought about what it meant to live in a world where you verified the honesty of law enforcement by observing their behavior in small administrative matters, because the alternative was to find out their dishonesty at a more expensive moment. He thought about what it meant to have built a life in that world, quietly, systematically, without surrendering anything essential, and to have done it alone, and to have done it so well. "Ida," he said. She looked up from the papers. He had not planned to say anything in particular. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the maps between them, and he said, I am glad you opened the gate." She looked at him for a moment in silence. The lamplight was warm and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Nevada night was cold and vast. Then she said, "So am I," and her voice was quieter than it usually was, and she looked back down at the papers, but something had shifted in the room. They worked for another hour, and then she said good night and went to bed, and he lay in the spare room and looked at the ceiling and felt not restless, which surprised him. He felt, for the first time in 18 months, as if he was in the right place. The next day, Ida filed her formal survey dispute with the county recorder's office and submitted her completed report to the town council. And Orville watched from the street while she did it, and watched the faces of the 2 Marston Company representatives who happened to be present in the recorder's office when she filed, and watched those faces change as they understood what they were looking at. They did not do anything overt. They were professional people, not frontier toughs, and they understood that doing something overt in a public office in front of witnesses was not the smart response. But their eyes found Orville's face when they came out of the office, and he held their gaze, and they walked away with the quick, controlled pace of people who needed to make a telephone. No, there was no telephone in Caldera Creek. There was a telegraph who needed to send a wire urgently. "They will be sending word to someone," he told Ida when she came out. "Yes," she said. "Let them. By the time anyone can act, Vargas will be here." Vargas arrived on the second day, which was faster than promised, because he had taken the night train to Winnemucca and ridden through the morning without stopping. He was a compact, dark-haired man of perhaps 35, with the permanently watchful eyes of a good lawman and a handshake that was decisive without being theatrical. He shook Orville's hand and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who had spent months examining a case and was now meeting the person at the center of it. "You are exactly what the file says you are," Vargas said. "Is that a compliment?" Orville asked. "In this context, yes," Vargas said. He turned to Ida and removed his hat. "Mrs. Bancroft, your work has been exceptional. The survey documentation alone would be sufficient for a civil case. Combined with what we have from the Arizona end, and what Harriet Folsom has been building through the federal land records, we have enough." "Enough to arrest Peck," Orville said. "Enough to arrest Peck, enough to initiate a federal investigation of Marston Silver and Minerals territorial operations, and enough to have your warrant in Arizona territory suspended formally pending review, which I am authorized to execute today." Vargas reached into his jacket and produced a document. "This is the suspension order. It is legitimate and signed by the territorial judge. You are not a free man yet, Turner, but you are not a wanted man today." Orville took the document and read it and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He was aware that his hands were not quite steady. "Thank you," he said. "Thank Mrs. Bancroft," Vargas said simply. "Her report is what made the federal office take this seriously." They arrested Gerald Peck the following morning. Vargas had brought 2 federal deputies, and they went to the Marston building at 8 o'clock precisely, and Gerald Peck came out of his office and looked at Orville standing in the street behind the federal marshal and went very still. It was a different stillness from the one Orville had seen across the Caldera Creek street 3 weeks ago. That stillness had been calculation. This one was the stillness of a man who understood that the calculation was finished. Peck said nothing when the handcuffs went on. He looked at Orville once, and Orville looked back at him, and then Peck looked away and did not look back. They held Peck in the Caldera Creek County Jail pending the federal proceedings, and Vargas spent the next 3 days taking depositions and working through the documents with Ida and executing the legal machinery that would dismantle what Peck had built here. 3 Marston Company officials were implicated in the claim fraud. 2 of them agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for consideration, which Vargas accepted with the pragmatism of someone who understood that cooperation was more valuable than punishment when the goal was a full accounting. The Haverson family, contacted through the county records, was located in Sacramento, where they had gone after selling the farm. The federal investigation would pursue recovery of the difference between what they had been paid and the actual value of the land. This process would take years, Vargas told Orville, with the honesty of a man who had operated within legal systems long enough to know their pace, but it would happen. On the fourth day after Peck's arrest, Vargas sat down with Orville at a table in the county sheriff's office and put the Arizona case materials in front of him. "The warrant will be formally vacated within 60 days, he said. "The evidence is clear enough and the political will is there, partly because 2 of Peck's Ray's brothers' contacts have been talking, and partly because the Tucson Marshal's office has been wanting to clean this up for months. Harrison Cook is retiring, which is a polite way of saying he is leaving before the internal review recommends his removal." "He knew," Orville said. He knew what Peck was doing." "He looked away from it," Vargas said, "which may or may not constitute knowing. The distinction matters legally and perhaps not at all ethically." Orville sat with that. Then he said, "What happens to Peck?" "Federal charges for the land fraud. Arizona charges for the evidence tampering, potentially for accessory to the assaults on you. He will not see free land for a considerable time." Vargas paused. "The men who shot at you on the mountain road, we have 2 of them identified through the livery records and a witness who saw them leave town that night. Warrants are in process." "You have been thorough," Orville said. "Mrs. Bancroft was thorough," Vargas said. "I built on a foundation she had already laid." Orville looked out the window. The October light was thin and clear on the Caldera Creek Main Street, and he could see Ida across the street, talking to the town council chairman, with her characteristic directness and the leather instrument case at her side. He watched her for a moment. "Turner," Vargas said, with the careful tone of a man who had noticed something and was choosing his words. "Yes. In 60 days, when this is formally finished, what are you going to do?" He looked at Vargas. Then he looked back out the window. "I have been thinking about that," he said. Vargas stood up and gathered his papers. "The Territorial Marshal's office in Carson City has been looking for a man with your specific kind of experience," he said, apparently to the air. "Someone who knows how fraud operates from the inside, who understands the difference between the law as it should be and the law as it sometimes is. It is not deputy work. It is investigative work, federal adjacent." He paused. "The position is based in Carson City, which is 2 days from here." He left the papers on the table and walked out, and Orville sat for a long time in the thin October light. That evening, he helped Ida carry her surveying equipment back from the recorder's office, where she had been cross-referencing her documentation with the official county records for the final time. They walked back to her farm in the cooling late afternoon, with the equipment cases distributed between them, and the sage was silver-purple in the slanting light, and the mountains were beginning to go pink at their peaks. "You have been quiet since this morning," she said. "Thinking," he said. "About what comes next?" "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. They were walking through the gate of her farm, the gate, the specific gate, the one he had pressed his forehead against 3 weeks ago, and he was acutely conscious of what this place had come to mean to him in those 3 weeks. He stopped in the yard, and she stopped a few feet ahead and turned to look at him. "I have been offered a position," he said. "Investigative work, territorial level, based in Carson City." "That is good news," she said. Her voice was even and measured, and he could not read what was underneath it. "It is 2 days' ride," he said. "From here." She looked at him. The evening light was doing something to the color of her face, warming it, and her eyes were very clear and direct. "Orville," she said, "say the thing you are actually trying to say." He had survived 12 years on the frontier partly by understanding when a direct approach was the right one. He looked at Ida Bancroft in the yard of her farm in the October light, and he said the thing he was actually trying to say. "I do not want to leave Caldera Creek," he said. "Not because I am afraid of leaving, but because the thing I would be leaving is you. And I know that is. I know the ground you are standing on, Ida. I know what the last 2 years have been, and I know this has been 3 weeks, and I am not going to pretend I do not understand the size of what I am asking." He stopped, started again. "But I have been living in the dark for 18 months, and I have been in your company for 3 weeks, and that is the most alive I have felt in longer than I can accurately account for, and I would very much like, if you are willing, to see what happens next." The yard was quiet. The mountains were pink. Somewhere in the stable, Copperfield moved in his stall. Ida Bancroft looked at Orville Turner for a long moment with the full weight of her attention, which was a considerable thing to be looked at with. "The position in Carson City," she said. "It would require you to travel. Some. But Carson City is the base." "Yes." "Which is 2 days from here," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I have the regional contract to consider. The Carson City District Land Office has been proposing it. If I took it, I would need to be in Carson City periodically, perhaps once a month." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the precise, clear expression of someone who had just finished a calculation and was presenting the result. "Ida," he said. "I am also saying yes," she said, "in case that was not clear." He crossed the yard in 3 steps, and she met him in the middle of it. And when he kissed her, she kissed him back with the same direct and total commitment she brought to everything she did. And the Nevada evening was cold around them, and the farm was solid and real under their feet, and he felt the weight of 18 months of dark finally, genuinely, lift. The 60 days passed in the way that days pass when you are in the right place and doing work that matters. Vargas closed the formal case in December, and the Arizona warrant was vacated with the quiet efficiency of a legal system correcting itself, which it could do when the will was present. Gerald Peck was remanded to federal custody and transported to the territorial prison at Yuma, where the federal land fraud charges alone guaranteed him a decade. The Marston Company settled the civil fraud claims before the new year, and the recovery process for the Haverson family and the other dispossessed landowners moved from theoretical to actual. Orville accepted the investigative position with the Territorial Marshal's office and took the train to Carson City in November to meet his new supervisor, a level-headed woman named Marshal Clara Dean, who ran the federal office with a dry competence that reminded him somewhat of Harriet Folsom, and who told him that what they needed was someone who had been out in the frontier and understood how fraud assembled itself in remote places where oversight was thin. He told her he understood this well. He rode back to Caldera Creek and arrived at Ida's farm in the early evening and let himself in through the gate. She had given him a key to the mechanism in October and put Juniper in the stable and went to the house and knocked. She opened the door and looked at him in the lamplight and said, "You look better." "I feel better," he said. "May I come in?" "You have a key to the gate," she said, stepping back to let him through. At this point, coming in is somewhat implied. He came in and hung his coat and hat, and they sat in the kitchen, and she had made coffee, and there was apple pie, which he had not had before and which was remarkable, and he told her about Carson City, and she told him about the regional contract she had formally accepted, and outside the Nevada night was settling into its winter cold. "I want to ask you something," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "I want to ask you properly," he said. Not in a moment, not implied, but directly. She looked at him. Her hands were around her coffee cup and her eyes were very steady. "Ida," he said, "I am not the same man I was 18 months ago, and some of that is because of what happened to me and some of it is because of you, and both of those things are true at once. I am a better man than I was, and I intend to keep being better, and I would like very much to do that in your company, permanent company." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me." The kitchen was warm and the lamp was steady, and the coffee was good, and outside the stars were coming out over the Nevada desert in the vast, cold, brilliant way they had in winter. "Yes," Ida said. "On the condition that we agree from the outset that this is a partnership in every sense, and that you do not make the mistake that some men make of confusing tenderness with dependence. I have never once thought you dependent on anything," he said with complete sincerity. "Good," she said. "Then yes. Absolutely and fully yes." They were married in January of 1883 in the Caldera Creek Church, with Harriet Folsom as a witness and Jim Beaumont, the county sheriff, as the other, and with a small collection of people who had come to know Ida over the previous 2 years and who thought, based on observation, that Orville Turner was exactly the kind of man she deserved, meaning, as one of them put it to another in the churchyard afterward, a man who clearly understood that keeping up with her was itself an admirable accomplishment, and who did not seem to find this emasculating, but rather the opposite. The farm became their base and their home, and Orville traveled to Carson City for his work, and returned always with the feeling of someone returning to a real place rather than a stopping point. He was good at the investigative work. His specific knowledge of how things went wrong in frontier territories, combined with a patience and precision that he suspected he had partly absorbed from watching Ida work, made him effective in ways that his supervisor acknowledged regularly. He was not made for the kind of desk-bound officialdom that some law enforcement settled into over time. He was made for reading situations, for understanding people, for the patient untangling of complicated deceptions. This suited the work. Ida took on the regional contract and became, over the following 2 years, one of the most respected survey professionals in the Nevada Territory. She testified before a federal land commission in 1884 about the Marston fraud, and her testimony was cited in the resulting federal guidelines for territorial mineral rights documentation, which was, she noted to Orville with dry satisfaction, not something she had expected her name to be attached to. In the spring of 1884, their son was born. They named him Robert James Turner Robert for Ida's first husband, whose memory she kept with the honest respect of someone who understood that loving again did not diminish what had been before, and James for Orville's father, who had been a good man in his own way, despite the considerable differences between Kansas Methodism and the Nevada frontier. The boy arrived with lungs that immediately made clear he had opinions and the vocal capacity to express them, and Orville, holding him in the farm kitchen in the April light while Ida rested, felt something new in his chest that joined the complicated geography of everything else he felt and made it complete in a way it had not been before. Robert James was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Clara after Marshall Dean, who had come to the farm for Sunday dinner often enough that she had become a genuine part of their lives. Clara Dean the younger arrived with an expression, Harriet Folsom said at the christening, that already suggested she was going to find most things mildly inadequate. "She takes after her mother," Orville said. "In the best possible sense," Ida said, and Harriet agreed. The Haverson family received their settlement in full by 1885, a longer process than anyone had hoped but a real one, and they returned to Nevada with enough capital to start again, which they did, and Ida surveyed their new property claim herself and filed it correctly and stood in the courthouse to make sure it went through. The warrant that had hung over Orville's name for 2 years was, as Vargas had promised, vacated fully and formally, with a written correction entered into the Arizona territorial record. It was a small thing in some ways, a piece of paper, a bureaucratic rectification, but Orville kept the document in a flat box under the bed beside the original piece of paper with Gerald Peck's name written on it, and occasionally he took both out and looked at them together, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who kept going in the direction of justice, even when justice did not appear to be pointed back at you. Vargas himself came to dinner in the spring of 1886, on his way through to San Francisco, and he sat at Ida's kitchen table eating her cooking and watching Orville chase 2-year-old Robert around the yard, and said to Ida, with the quiet certainty of someone stating a thing they had observed, "He is exactly where he should be." "I know," Ida said, and watched them through the window with the expression of a person who has done difficult work, and found that it was worth it and is not surprised by this, because she had known it would be before she was done. On the night of their third anniversary, they sat on the porch of the farm, Orville's farm now as much as hers. Every fence post and water trough and square foot of Nevada earth as familiar as breath. And the January night was cold and brilliant, and the stars were extraordinary. And Ida leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable silence of people who did not need to fill the dark with noise. "I have been thinking," he said, "about adding the north pasture. If I put in a fence along the creek line, the spring grazing would support another 8 or 10 head. You have been talking to Cassidy," she said. "He sold me the concept," Orville said. "The specifics I need your opinion on. I will look at the terrain next week," she said. "The creek line runs over an interesting geological transition just north of the draw. It may affect fence post stability." "Of course it does," he said. She laughed, the real, full laugh that she gave when something genuinely delighted her, which it still did. 3 years and 2 children and a life built together on the Nevada frontier on. He felt the laugh against his chest and looked at the stars and thought about the man who had crawled through the dark toward a light in the distance, convinced that no one in the world was going to help him, that the world had decided against him and was proving it. He thought about the gate opening. He thought about a woman with a Winchester and a lantern, and a mind like a precision instrument, standing in the dark with her feet solidly planted, and her aim clear, and her gate open to a stranger bleeding in the dust, not because she was reckless or naive or sentimental, but because she had decided, with the clear and irrefutable logic of someone who understood what mattered and what did not, that closing the door on that was not acceptable. He pulled her a little closer, and she settled more firmly against his side, and neither of them said anything. And the Nevada night was cold and vast and full of stars, and the farm was real and warm and permanent around them, and the gate was closed and latched, and they were on the inside of it together, and the dark was just the dark, not an enemy, not a threat, just the necessary companion of light. Robert James Turner would later, at 7 years old, ask his father to tell him the story of how his parents had met. Orville told it honestly, including the part about lying in the dust outside the gate, and Robert James found this very satisfying. "And then Mama opened it," the boy said. "And then Mama opened it," Orville said, "because she knew you needed help, because she decided that closing the door was not acceptable," Orville said. "Which is your mother in every particular." The boy thought about this seriously. Then he said, "Is that why you love her?" Orville Turner looked at his son in the lamplight of the farm kitchen, and thought about Ida in her surveying office with the theodolite and the parallel rule, and thought about the plan she had laid out at midnight with coffee and maps, and thought about the way she had said "so am I," when he had said he was glad she had opened the gate, and thought about every morning of 3 years waking up in the same house, as the most capable and honest and real person he had ever known. "That," he said, "is one of the many reasons I love her." Clara, who was sitting on the floor with a set of wooden blocks and had been listening with the quiet attentiveness she had displayed since infancy, looked up and said, with the mild authority of a 2-year-old who has formed an opinion, "Mama." "Yes," Orville agreed. "Exactly." The spring of 1887 brought 2 things to the Turner farm. A letter from the Federal Land Commission asking Ida to serve as a consulting expert on a major territorial survey project that would take several months and would be, as the letter noted, the most comprehensive land documentation effort in Nevada Territory's history, and a third child, another boy, named August after the month in which Orville had finally ridden into Caldera Creek, the month that had led to all the rest of it. August Turner arrived with his mother's dark hair and his father's stubborn jaw, and an expression that suggested he was already considering several options simultaneously, and Harriet Folsom, at the christening, said he was going to be interesting. "They are all interesting," Orville said. "Yours especially," Harriet said, and looked at Ida with the affection of a colleague and a friend. Ida accepted the commission and planned the project with her characteristic thoroughness. arranging the fieldwork to accommodate the children and the farm and Orville's schedule with the same logical efficiency, she brought to a survey calculation. Not because the logistics were more important than the work, but because they were part of the work, and ignoring them was what produced structural failures. Orville watched her plan it and thought, as he did regularly, about what it meant to be in the company of this specific person. Not a woman who needed him to be her strength, but a woman who brought her own strength fully, and who wanted his not as a replacement, but as a complement, the way two load-bearing walls work together to make something neither could make alone. He had not known it was possible to feel this way about a person. He had not, if he was honest, previously understood what it meant when people talked about finding their equal in a partner. Had thought it was a sentimental notion, an idealization of the fundamental separateness of people. He understood it now with the certainty of a man who had lived the actual version of it for 4 years. The regional survey project took 18 months and produced a document that became the definitive reference for Nevada Territory land claims for the next decade. Ida's name was on the cover, which was, by 1887, less unusual than it had been in 1882, but still not entirely unremarkable, and she received it with the same equanimity with which she received everything, acknowledging the significance without performing surprise, because she had known the work was good, and that good work deserved acknowledgement. Orville celebrated it with a dinner he cooked himself, which was an area where he was not Ida's equal and did not pretend to be, and which the children found enormously entertaining. "It is fine," Ida told the children with the straight face of someone who was very slightly lying. "It is not as good as your cooking," Robert James agreed. "It is made with effort and affection," Orville said, "which counts for something." "It counts," Ida agreed, and squeezed his hand across the table, and the kitchen was warm and the children were fed and the Nevada evening was settling outside and the gate was latched and they were home. At the end of the day, which is what all days eventually become, it was this: a man who had dragged himself through the dark toward a light, and a woman who had made the decision to open a gate. Two people who had found in each other not a rescue and a rescued, but a genuine matching of force and intelligence and character that made both of them larger than either had been alone. A farm in Nevada, real and rooted in the earth. Children who would grow up knowing that strength and tenderness were not opposites, that a woman could read a hillside like a book, and a man could be moved to his core by watching her do it. That love was not the softening of capable people, but the recognition of capability by capability, which was something rarer and more durable. The gate was always latched from the inside, and they both had the key, and they opened it when they chose to together on their own terms into whatever morning came next.